Hello, everyone. This is a new episode of the Anagagi podcast, and I have a new guest today that I'm very, very excited about. I've been reading his work, and basically everything that I've read from him is absolutely fascinating. And I've initially come across him by Verveki, that he's also been on this channel, and you can check out that podcast if you haven't. I believe he's also acquainted to Daniel. I believe maybe has a colleague, maybe has a friend. I'm not quite sure. He has also been on the channel. I think he was my second guest on the show, which makes it quite funny because that makes it like a third of all my guests have been from, from the University of Toronto, which I think is quite funny. But so yeah, hello and welcome, Juensung Kim. And if you maybe could give a little introduction about yourself and what you do, that would be great.
Oh, and thanks for having me. I didn't actually know that you had Dan on the podcast. That's funny. Should see if you can get Anderson, then you can get all the entire quadfecta, as it were. Yeah, so I'm Juensung. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. My research, kind of loosely speaking, looks at the phenomenology and mechanisms of self-transformation, in particular practices that encourage the process, which I then, of course, turn around and joke was really just a way to get U of T to let me study magic for a living. So yeah, I'm in particular interested in kind of the aspiration to self-transformation, the project of becoming a wiser person or becoming a more virtuous person is not one that is commonly taken on, much to my consternation. So some of my interests are in looking at, okay, where does that goal come from? What practices do people use to undertake it? Things like that.
Right. And so I want to understand a little bit more exactly how magic plays into this, into your work, in terms of, transformative experiences but maybe not just experiences, but, the goal of transformation itself. Do you see magic as kind of one aspect of that in your work, or do you kind of exclusively focus on magic, and how does that relate to self-transformation? Like how much does one occupy the other?
I'd say magic is an aspect of what I'm interested in. I'd say for me, the more fun aspect of what I'm interested in, it gets me opportunities like this one. Like my other work is like, how do we design university programs to make people aspire to be better people? Which is, that's not a small problem. And it's like, it's the backbone of a lot of what I do. But then you start talking about magic and suddenly everybody wants to talk.
Right. Okay, so let's talk then. So let's kind of put the cards on the table, and maybe we can get a little bit into what is magic. Just a short introduction, and maybe cover the etymology of it and the meaning. I think that's always helpful when introducing topics.
Sure. Although magic is interestingly one of those words in which the etymology will not help you. But I guess first let's get something straight here, because unfortunately I think as much as I love video games and like I run Dungeons and Dragons games and things like that, like I love that kind of thing, they have done magic a grave disservice insofar as just what popular conception of magic is turned into. If you read classical texts of magic, there's no throwing fireballs. It's actually kind of a pity. I'd love to throw fireballs, but no, that's not my wheelhouse. So I guess sure. Let's start with the etymology, because that can illustrate why it's not helpful. So the English language gets the word magic from the ancient Greek word for Persian priests, the magia. So that might be a very strange place to start, because, well, actually, this does help a little bit, because the earliest ideas of at least the word magic come from these ideas of non-state sponsored or state sanctioned religious rituals. It's kind of like, there's the state sanctioned, okay, here are the Olympian gods and here are our rites and mysteries and worship. And then there's what those other guys do. Because if you're thinking about, it's kind of interesting. Like the idea that we now have of magic is kind of a bunch of actually different ways of thinking that all got kind of boiled down together over 2,000 years of Christianity. Because the Greeks were skilled practitioners of what we would consider magic, honestly. As far as like, ancient Greece was littered with mystery cults, all sorts of charms, summoning rituals. Necromancy actually plays a fairly large role in a couple of Greek ethics, as far as summoning the dead and offering them libations in exchange for information. They didn't consider it magic. Magic was what the Persians did. This is just what we're doing.
Right.
So now that said, one of the other concepts that kind of gets bound up in it is this notion of, I think the Greek term is goetia, sorcery, basically, because these things were originally different things. And then there's also later in antiquity, you get the concept of theurgy, or I'm almost positive that if you've had Dan on the podcast, that's come up. But this idea of invoking the gods in order to achieve magical or mystical effects. And then you can boil down most of Western history into one of two things. And then Christianity happened, and then Britain happened.
Huh. Why Britain?
Because Britain was basically, like, if you're talking about like the history of like far-flung like places that Britain then showed up and colonized,
Right.
There's always and Britain happened, or you can even just say and colonization happened. Or if you're talking about like the history of Europe itself, you can say and then Christianity happened. Because when Christianity came on the scene, all of these ideas kind of got jumbled up. Because now the ancient Greeks were also the religious rituals of the other guy, right? So they kind of got bound up with magic. Magic, magia in Greek is what gave us the word magus in Latin, which has these connotations of magic magician, but also has connotations of charlatan, deceiver, etc. Basically because it's like, no, our religious rites and rituals work, but I don't know what these other guys are doing. That doesn't work. Or at least that
was kind of the negative connotation, simply because they were an outgroup, and is that always tied to if it functions or not? Because I always had the idea that, when you kind of think that these other people have these rituals and these beliefs that are weird, it's not so much about the functionality of it. Like, in fact, a lot of times in very early religious stories, and even in the Bible, it's not like it's only one God. So they're not denying the other gods, just that they're false gods or gods that shouldn't be, shouldn't be worshipped. But it's, I had the idea that they still think it works.
Well, so this is kind of an interesting thing up until the early modern period, right? Where if you like crack into Augustine, is kind of like, well, yes, okay, like people are having these like making these like charms and spells and practices and things like that, but they're not getting these from angelic forces or gods. There's only one God. Clearly these are demons masquerading as gods. And then if you dig into histories on like Joan of Arc in France, for instance, who her whole thing was she heard the I think it was the voice of like Saint Michael say, lead the French to freedom from the English, because welcome to the history of Europe. And then England happened. Then, like, if you look at her trial, basically the things that she was accused of was like, no, we believe you heard voices. We just don't think you heard the Archangel Michael or God or a positive force in the world. And then kind of in the early modern period, like Europe gets really weird with regards to its approach to magic, where it's kind of like, no. None of this stuff works. But also we have to accuse you of witchcraft and burn you for heresy.
But like what you mentioned about demons, it gets even more complicated, because having contact with demons could even be, was even seen sometimes as acceptable, as long as it was like a saint commanding a demon, because a demon was also like just a source of power. So as long as it's like within the proper hierarchy of that it's submitting to gods, then from my understanding historically they've been used like that as well.
Oh yeah, like the Lesser Key of Solomon is filled with stuff like that, and like the Goetic arts during the Renaissance were basically all that. Like, hello, demons, submit to the will of divine and give me information. The church still didn't like it.
Right. So you mentioned the difference between magic and sorcery. So what's the difference exactly?
In modern era, basically nothing.
In ancient, civilization, whatever you want to call it.
Oh, it was basically. So this gets into an interesting little bit of history, where magic was foreign arts, whereas I guess you could kind of loosely call like sorcery is like esoteric arts, where like, okay, yes, these are culturally ours, but they're kind of like hush hush and like don't practice in the light of day kind of thing.
Got it. So in one of your papers, you mentioned several approaches to magic. You mentioned the psychological, the sociological, and the anthropological. Can you maybe explain what those are and how does your work fit into those?
Right. And I mean, I should say I'm revising that paper. It's currently in a preprint, but I've done a lot of research over the last year and a bit that I kind of want to plug into that later. So I'd actually say that maybe more properly speaking, there's kind of two camps in psychology these days. But loosely speaking, the psychological camp is kind of the study of magic in terms of magical thinking, where the idea is, okay, like why do at the individual level people believe in like witchcraft and demon summoning and things like that? And the psychological approach has historically been like, oh, this is just an aberration in natural human phenomenology and rationality, and whether our job is to explain it away. Recently, I'd say in the last 5 years, that camp has actually started to split a little bit, where I'd say the majority is still on the no, we got to explain this away side of things. But then there's people like, what's his name off the top of my head? Smolensky, I think is his name, Eugene Smolensky, who he's recently written a few books. It's like, okay, I've spent 30 years of my career studying magical thinking and the imagination, and my conclusions are you're not going to get rid of these. If you want like a natural human with the capacity for creativity and rationality and all these other wonderful things, you get magic. There's no way to you can take the tiger out of the jungle, but you can't take the jungle out of the tiger kind of deal. The sociological approach is kind of more looking at magic as like a phenomenon, because sociologists aren't dealing with individual problems of human rationality. So their take is more, okay, regardless of whether this is a rational thing or not, this is a thing that humans do. Like, here's kind of like the social group dynamics of magic, and here's like I'd say kind of typical of this group is a fellow by the name of Jason Josephson Storm, which like, oh man, like of all the names you can have for a guy who studies magic, that's top tier name. But anyway, yeah, his take is just like, yeah, this is just like, in particular, his case is pushing back on the Weberian or Weberian, depending on where you are in the world, idea of the disenchantment. Because his take is like, no, this is a load of crock. The world has not gotten any less enchanted. It's just gotten more weirdly enchanted, less uniformly enchanted. As while belief in like the Christian church has waned, I have never seen so many different types of tarot cards in my life.
Yeah, that's something that really annoys me about magic, and even religion in general. People think that we can just that we can get rid of it, and that we have in some sense gotten rid of it, and that's it's just so wrong that it just boggles my mind how people even think that. Like it has varied a bit, but like the amount of superstition and just general pseudoscience is just it's just insane. I don't understand how people think that.
Oh yeah, and this is Storm's point, is that enchantment hasn't gone away. It's gotten more individualized. Thank you, internet. Now, like, everybody can find a niche.
Exactly. And so what's the anthropological lens?
So the anthropologists, I think, are these are the people that I have the most intellectual respect for, because they're the sort of people that have to ask the question of, well, why did we do this in the first place? Right, because they're looking at humanity from a species level, and so they're having to go, well, okay, humans are clearly not stupid. A lot of magic is like very, very taxing from an energy point of view, right? If your goal is survival, magic is a very expensive thing to do with your calories, as well as your time that you could be using for hunting and things like that. So the question that the anthropologists were forced to ask is, well, why do we do this? And as a result, they've been kind of the most charitable towards it, because they've been the ones that have been forced to actually look at what the benefits of magic are, as opposed to, well, this is just irrational. Well, yes, but as it turns out, certain forms of irrationality are actually beneficial to survival. And I mean, this is also the one that has the longest standing tradition. Like, you can I think most people loosely trace the anthropology of magic back to James Fraser, although the book The Golden Bough, although he had a couple of predecessors. Also, Fraser was an armchair anthropologist. So take everything he says with a grain of salt. But kind of the queen of the field at the moment is Tanya Luhrmann's work, which like in the last year, like as an academic, it is very interesting to see something that is like clearly somebody's magnum opus. And so in the last year, she's like put out some work that's basically, okay, and here is one was Persuasions of the Rich. Here's my 25-year-long research project on, loosely speaking, magic, and kind of more specifically, what it means to make something that is imaginary feel real. Going all the way from like loose and like thick anthropological qualitative description, boiled all the way into psychometrics.
That's amazing. I have to check her work out.
No, her work.
Awesome. So how does those three perspectives appear in your work? How does your work relate to it?
I mean, the nice thing about being a cognitive scientist is you get to steal everybody else's work, and you don't actually have to belong to one. So there is kind of emerging a fourth camp, even before I got here, which was the cognitive science camp, which was basically people trying to say, no, we can have a cognitive science of magic and esotericism. That is possible. Look, all we have to do is like frame magic or esotericism in the correct way. And then like once we have like a working scientific definition of it, then we can start studying it.
And when was that, by the way?
Kind of starting around like 2010-ish.
Oh, so very, very recent.
Oh, yeah. Like the last 10, 15 years-ish. This is people like Sorensen, I think is his name. Egil Asperum is like another big name in this kind of area. Oh, I am a big fan of Asperum's work because I deeply admire the work of people who are like, clearly you would be a fascinating person to talk to at a bar. Because he is very clearly well read in both like cognitive science and a history of Western esotericism. But speaking from experience, it takes a very weird mind to think, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stick them together. That's a good career choice, right? Yeah, anyway, so my take on it is actually, we already actually have a scientific research project on magic. We just have to get all the pieces of it to start talking together. Because psychological work on ritual exists, right? All the stuff on like mindfulness meditation, stuff like that all exists. Like if you take the toolbox of a working magician, that you can kind of examine through an anthropological lens. Like you can use anthropology to say, okay, like what are the toolboxes of a practitioner of magic? And then say, okay, what is this piece? What is this piece? What is this piece? What is this piece? My take is we actually already have established research programs on all of the individual pieces. We just need to force them all to talk.
Yeah, that's something that I really like about cognitive science in general is this ability to like put things together in a coherent manner, and that has like an overall framework. Because before I started looking into cognitive science, that's something that I've always been interested in, like philosophy and psychology and religion and all that. And what I've always thought was like, why are these separate? They shouldn't be. These are all the same things. It's just a slightly different angle, and these need to be put together. And then when I discovered that, well, there's actually a field that kind of tries to do that, and I was just like, my mind is just blown. But yeah, that's a good description of it, and I've kind of I see that thread in your work, and it seems very, very fruitful. And I'm very hopeful about the field in general in the future and how's it going to turn out. So you mentioned theoretical magic versus practical magic. So maybe let's try to get a bit into that of how does this stuff actually works, and what are different aspects of it that people can better understand that are not, very abstract, but like how people actually practice these things and thought about it.
Right. So the difference between theoretical and practical magic was kind of first, I think, posited by Fraser, where kind of his take is the practices themselves and the framework that people use to explain them are not quite the same thing. Because I think he refers to one of them. I think it's theoretical magic as kind of like to use unfortunate 19th century language, the bastard half sister of science. Where it's like, here's people doing things and here's people trying to explain it. They're clearly wrong because I am an Englishman and I know everything. I apologize to any listeners who are from Britain. I'm half British myself. So take this slight ribbing of British intellectual and political history with the self-mockery that it's coming with. Yeah, so, and actually there's even kind of a more modern distinction that Lerman has started using, which is, her argument is that, loosely speaking, like magical talent or talent for imaginal practices or skill in imaginal practices has three components. The first is there is a natural talent for it. Some people are naturally more inclined towards imaginal practices than others. And what's actually kind of cool is that she's managed to like kind of loosely quantify magical talent, which has all sorts of fascinating implications.
How does that look like?
Oh, it's basically there are a few scales that measure the vividness of somebody's imagination. And kind of the more fundamentally vivid your imagination is without any sort of outside intervention, that's more or less a loose measure of magical talent.
Does implicit learning play a role as well? Or does she not include that in?
I mean, I could make an argument that implicit learning plays a role, but no, it's basically just purely like how the kind of factor that it measures is referred to as absorption, which is like how inclined are you to become fully absorbed into sensation.
And that also related to being suggestible, right?
Yeah, loosely. I mean, there's an argument to be made that a lot of magic is just auto hypnosis, but anyway. So that's the concept of there being like talent for this kind of thing is like a third angle that she's brought in. But her other two pieces of the puzzle loosely map onto practical and theoretical magic. One is like the actual like practice and the skill set that you learn as a magician. And then the third is the kind of like cultural sphere of expectations that you bring into it. So the example that she uses is Christians learning to talk to God, for instance. One of the things that involves is having to learn to perceive your own mind as being permeable to some outside force. And what she's found is that there is cultural variation in the assumption of how permeable the mind is. For instance, I think what she found is that like people in like Ghana and India, the cultural expectation of your mind being permeable is higher than in, say, the United States. And so then what she's found is that it is easier for people in those cultures even holding like talent and training constant, to experience God talking to them because they're not fighting their own instincts quite as much.
So I don't think I've seen you mention this. Maybe you did, but I'm not recalling. But I follow this weird YouTube channel that makes some crazy book reviews and book openings, and he's very into magic. And at the time when I first started watching his videos, I was actually, very condescending towards magic. I was like, this is just dumb. But for some reason, his videos had, I don't know, a strange captivation on me. Maybe just because I didn't know anything about it, but I really enjoyed watching him a bit talking about magic, and it seems so complicated. It's just beyond comprehension. But one of the things that I've seen him mention a lot that I don't think I've seen in your work is that very big differences in Western magic versus Eastern magic. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that.
I agree and I disagree. I don't know. I mean, maybe this is because, me being both a cognitive scientist and therefore kind of interdisciplinary by training, as well as from a mixed cultural background and therefore kind of interdisciplinary by nature. I can see where somebody who is from a singular background is coming from with the, oh man, Eastern magic is really different than Western magic. But not really, actually. It depends on where you go, right? Like, I'd say there are aspects of Taoist magic that overlap surprisingly well with Wicca. On Myoji in Japan, you can rewrite the formulae and basically end up at Western Hermetic magic, because the symbols are very different. The way that the universe is carved up, the kind of the theoretical magic, shall we say, is very different. But if you strip away the theoretical magic and look purely at the practical magic, and then take basically the what my work is trying to do, and take the lens of cognitive science, and kind of as basically, spoiler alert, my take is that you should if we want to have like a cognitive science of magic, the project actually needs to be to replace theoretical magic with cognitive science. But well, not replace it. Like, cultural understanding is always going to be a thing, but you should theoretically be able to explain all of practical magic in terms of cognitive science. But yeah, if you put the cognitive science frame on it and look at both Western practical magic and Eastern practical magic, they end up looking very similar, despite the fact that their respective cultural theoretical magics do not look the same at all.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, and I think it actually attests to the project of the cognitive science of magic, because that's almost exactly what you would predict, right? Because there's cultural variation, so like the kind of the systems that they employ are going to be different, depending on the cultural and the conditions and their ecology. But then what they're trying to do is basically the same thing. So that's a pretty big strength and a pretty big suggestion that there's actually something going on underneath it. Maybe not what we typically think of it, but something valuable and something worth looking into for sure. So something that I would like you to explore, that I'm trying to get my mind to grasp better, is how does magic relate to shamanism? Because they're clearly related, but it doesn't strike me as the same thing. And maybe it's just my preconceptions of what magic is, in part because of what you said in the beginning of that we have a very stereotypical, not very accurate depiction of it. But if you think about how at least the common culture perceives magic in like medieval Europe, of like, I don't know, crystal ball and evoking. I mean, you can see a lot of the same themes through shamanism, but it still feels different. Mm-hmm. So what exactly are the similarities and the differences between them?
I mean, the kind of flippant answer to this is like, you see in like fantasy media all the time, people talking about like, ooh, old magic, not like this like modern wizardry. Shamanism is basically like real world old magic. It's kind of the source material. And I mean, if you're familiar with Vervaeke's work, you've heard all the stuff about like the axial revolution and psychotechnologies and stuff like that. My take on it is kind of that like every culture kind of like abstracted certain elements of shamanism in order to arrive at their hallmark psychotechnologies. So basically what every culture did is they took like an element of magic and decided to like take it and absolutely run with it. So like Greece took like observation of patterns in the natural world, because dirty little secret about the history of science that most people do not like having spread around. Bacon almost wholesale ripped off the scientific method from Renaissance esotericists, who thought that nature was keeping secrets from them, and the only way to divine the truth of nature was to try and trick it into a contradiction. Yeah, basically it's like magic has been observing the natural world for a very, very long time. And then the trick is, can you replicate a natural phenomenon artificially? Which is, hey, look, congratulations, you have arrived at science. But, it's not just that, right? Like, basically, the ancient Middle East took, like, the narrative cosmology angle of magic and really ran with that. India took the skills of manipulating the mind and the imagination and abstracted and layered and systematized those to an absolutely mind-boggling degree. China took an interesting combination of things where China kind of took like the concept of ritual and really, really blew it up. Because like there's a ritual system to basically John and I have had a back and forth on this for a while, and we think that like the quintessential Chinese psychotechnology that you get out of the Axial Revolution is the Chinese concept of Li, which you can translate that as ritual, but it's more commonly these days like translated as like propriety or just like correct behavior. But basically the idea that there is role and system and order to human society, and people need to play those rules, and that like you enact certain things. There's also an argument to be made that like all of Chinese medicine is just systematized shamanism, which I don't know. I say that and then people are like, aha, and that means it doesn't work. Well, actually, no, it does work. It works in a, like, do you know how hard it is to reliably invoke the placebo effect for everything?
Maybe that's a good place to start as well, because kind of what made me see magic in a different way was exactly the placebo effect, because it's this shift in like perspective of how you think reality works, because kind of the normal approach in our materialistic scientific worldview is kind of to think of placebo as if it's the negative of something not working. It's what you compare it to see if something is working. Therefore, if it's placebo, it's not a causal power, and therefore it doesn't exist. But that's actually not true at all. It does exist, and the fact that you can study it and the fact that you have to compare it to means that it exists. And then people think, well, placebo is just just this little thing of being suggestible and whatever. But once you look into it, it's fascinating to a degree that it's barely comprehensible. And then once you start thinking about it, that's pretty damn close to magic. When you like, it's just that people are very they have a repulsion to it, to the topic and to the word itself. So maybe you can touch a bit on the parallel of placebo and magic, and what does two have in common?
I mean, that's a bit of a tricky one, because much like there are individual differences in absorption, there are individual differences in hypnotizability and suggestibility, right? Which basically means that there are individual differences in susceptibility to the placebo effect. So one of the things that I always have to be careful of is I am not advocating that we replace like chemical and like physical medicine with magic. That is absolutely not what I'm advocating at all. Like, if you have cancer, go to an oncologist. I'm sorry, but like, do not witchcraft until it's the absolute last option you have. Because the thing is that magical rituals for curing cancer will work on like 10 to 15% of the population, while chemotherapy will work on about 90% of the population. So chemotherapy is therefore significantly more reliable and probably better in most cases. But you also have to think of it in terms of not having access to chemo, right? Like, if both of us are like ancient tribes people, and my tribe has a shaman, and like 10% of us can be fixed through shamanic healing rituals, and your tribe does not have a shaman, and therefore none of you can be fixed through shamanic healing rituals, my tribe's going to survive better than your tribe.
And that was basically exactly what happened, because medicine that actually works is surprisingly recent. It's like 200 years old at best. And like everything else besides it, 95% either made no difference or it made it worse. So the placebo there was...
Well, you can get a decent amount out of basic herbalism a lot of the time, actually. Like, one of the things that people need to remember is that like a lot of modern chemical medicine is just old herbal medicine that has had like everything other than the effective components stripped away.
Well, first of all, I think it depends a lot of the culture that you're thinking. Like, I'm kind of talking a bit out of my ass here. I'm not sure if this actually applies, but the idea that I have is that I would have a lot more trust in herbal medicines from tribal people than medieval society. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe it's just a preconception that I have of what I've read.
I think that's a bit of an unfair bias, because like medical history loves to demonize itself. I don't know why, but like, because everybody's just like, oh, everybody in the medieval era was like snake oil salesmen, things like that. And I mean, like, yeah, like when you're not like running on like germ theory and stuff like that, I mean, there's one thing, but like they had some basic stuff figured out. Like, basically there was a lot of like, we don't know why this works. We just know that like, if we do this to you, you survive better than if we don't do it to you. Because, you know, there's a reason why medicine and magic have gone together historically a lot of the time, right? So the issue that you end up having is a similar split between practical medicine and theoretical medicine. Medieval theoretical medicine is all over the place. Medieval practical medicine, not horrible. I still would prefer to live now because, like, again, I like joke with a friend of mine, the microbiologist, where modern medicine is really only better at three things than medieval medicine: anesthetic, invasive surgery, and antibiotics.
Well, those are pretty big, big advancements.
Yeah, it's like, those are pretty big advances. Let's not lie.
But this example is actually a perfect illustration of the problem of theoretical versus practical magic, and in this case, medicine, because you can say that practical medicine worked, or at least it was experienced as working. But for example, something that really affected early medicine was, for example, survivorship bias, for example. And that's something almost impossible to get rid of unless you have modern knowledge of psychology and statistics.
Oh.
Like, it's really hard.
I mean, I'd absolutely. Yeah. Because the issue that you get is, but like really, I think really the only thing that modern medicine has on older medicine, aside from like surgery, anesthetic, and antibiotics, is reliability. Because we have figured things out like dosage, for instance, and like, okay, no. Like, you actually only need like this one like molecule that is found in this particular flower. You don't need to eat the entire thing.
There's also the opposite problem, because you mentioned that, you know, a lot of modern medicines just come from plants, and some of them have been used forever, and that's true. But you also get the opposite problem sometimes. It's just that, you know, sometimes you can get this medicine from a plant, but maybe the plant only has 0.5% of that medicine. So it works, but it works a little bit, because you can't just eat 1 kilo of leaves. Like, you'll probably get poisoned by some other chemical.
Yeah, exactly. So again, that for me, that's a reliability thing, right? It's right. We know exactly what component of this leaf you need to eat and in what quantity, and we can do it in such a way that you don't also get like arsenic poisoning alongside it.
Right. So something that I really liked on one of your papers was how you connected the rubber hands illusion to magic. So maybe explore that a little bit. And for those people that maybe I'll just leave it to the cognitive sciences. That's your expertise. So people who are not familiar with it, I mean, maybe if you study psychology, you've probably encountered it at some point. But if you have a hand, if your own hand or your own arm is not visible to you, and then you have a fake arm or a fake hand, and that hand is touched at the same time that your real hand is, then you start to get this feedback that whenever the fake hand is touched, then you feel it. And then after a while, if you do that enough times, then you get an association. And then, you know, it basically, if someone kind of tries to hammer your hands, you'll recoil automatically. Like, you can't even choose not to. So it's a pretty fascinating experiment, and it's a classic of psychology. But it was the first time I've seen someone make a connection with magic. So how exactly do you make that argument?
Well, I mean, you know, this is for me kind of a paradigmatic case of everything looks funny if you squint at it. Because one of the like big things in Western magic, and like Eastern magic also has this, but they use different words for it. But like one of the big things in Western magic, and especially modern Western magic, is this concept of an astral body, or like or it's also called a subtle body. Like here's your physical body, but there's another body that you have that is kind of also you. And in a lot of magical practices, it's this subtle body that magic is actually playing on, right? Like, for instance, if you were to use shape-shifting magic, it's not your physical body that changes into a wolf. It's your subtle body that changes into a wolf, which has differing characteristics and such like that. But so, you know, this is kind of an aspect of, and this is also what people use for like astral travel or like out of body experiences or things like that. Like this is the thing that lets you leave your body. And then, I don't know, my favorite thing with scientists is like, yeah, there's no such thing as magic. But, oh yeah, by the way, using like 2 mirrors, a mannequin, and a paintbrush, we can shove your soul out of your body. It's like, yeah, what do you think this is? Because like the rubber hand illusion has been scaled up to like full-blown experimentation with the feeling of ownership over a particular area of space. So my current favorite is what's called the invisible body illusion, which is you put a headset on somebody and like it has the like same perspective as the camera, and you synchronously like stroke a paintbrush along their entire body, along with like stroke a paintbrush through empty air, so that the visual signal that is going to like your headset and the tactile signal that's going to your body matches the visual and tactile signal of a brush moving over empty air. And if you can do that, then you attack the space of empty air with a knife, and people don't like it.
I imagine. Something that I find a bit weird, and maybe you can kind of explain that to me a little bit, is that these kind, like seeing this type of science where it shows how malleable your perception of the body is, kind of seems to, I'm sure it doesn't, and I'm sure you're going to argue against it, but the way it looks to me at the first intuition is it kind of seems to go against the principle of embodied cognition, because the embodied cognition is like your cognition is in the body and kind of spreads out. But these types of experiments, at least to me, seem kind of to suggest that actually your experience seems very generated by the brain alone, and the bodies actually can be malleable very, very easily. So how are these perspectives clashing?
Because I would say that this experience is still being generated by your body. Right? Like you need your body in order to experience that tactile sense, right? It's just that there's misdirection involved that is relocating that tactile sense.
Mm-hmm. Right. That makes sense.
So it's not that your body is no longer involved in the processing. It's just that your locus of experience just happens to not be in your body at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
like that, I think that it's interesting is that it turns out that you can completely separate the locus of, or like the experienced center of control and experience. Yeah, you can just take that out of somebody's body. Like your body is still here. Your body is still running all of the processing. It's just that your locus of experience is not here anymore.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So, this is a good topic to get into. I don't think I've seen you mention this, but I'm going to guess that you know a lot about it because it's pretty related. So let's talk a bit about astrology, and I like this example because it's something so easy to. I mean, you just seem so excited. You just can't contain it.
Reliable thing. Everybody always asks about astrology.
But I'm going to tell you why I'm mentioning astrology.
No, please go on.
Because it's so easy, because it's so easy from a modern perspective to just like completely ignore it. And it seems completely reasonable to ignore it. It just seems batshit insane. It makes no sense whatsoever compared to our understanding of how the universe works and how the planets work. But something that really kind of I don't know, made me feel very weird about it, and not only changed how I look at astrology, but made me change how I look about any of this more esoteric stuff. Was reading Jung, and I know that you don't like Jung very much, but he mentioned astrology. Yeah, sorry.
But I'm apparently a little infamous for that.
You are. But you know, he mentioned a bit of astrology, and I can't quite explain it here because I didn't understand it very well myself. Like his writings on alchemy are already pretty hard, and astrology I found it even harder. But even though I didn't fully understand what he was trying to get at, I just had this underwhelming sense that there is something to it, and I was dumb to just completely disregard it. I don't mean that in a metaphysical sense, but I mean it in a psychological sense. And so, and for me, that was kind of a wake-up call, because astrology was kind of, you know, if there's a spectrum of what I consider respectable, astrology was like so much at the bottom. That's, you know, there's not that much there. And so if that can make me, you know, kind of not dismiss it right off the bat, and that there's something to it, maybe not what most people think, but something to it, you know, I think that's a pretty strong case for magical things in general. So yeah, shoot me. I know that you love astrology.
Okay, I should preface this by saying I don't like astrology.
Who would have known?
I have a reasonably reasoned argument for why I don't like it, but I am forced to admit that at the end of the day, given everything else that I have my fingers into, this is a bias. The bias, I think, largely comes from astrology being really one of the only branches of magic that's contradictory. Because, like, whose astrology are we running on? You want ancient Babylonian astrology? Do you want, like, modern, like, Greek-derived astrology? Do you want, like, Indian astrology? Do you want, like, Chinese astrology? Like, these are all different things. And unlike other Western or Eastern systems of magic, right, where you can kind of impose different metaphysics onto the world in order to have different systems that work, it's the same sky. Like, these individual points of light cannot be, like, I don't know. Basically, it's like I find it like, yes, there are ways that you can make it work, but I find it very difficult to accept a system where the same point of light at the exact same point in space can mean two different things in two systems.
Well,
I find that's frustrating.
I'm not sure how that makes it completely impossible, but because you can make models that work even if your assumptions are wrong. So, for example, we can make models of the cosmos that are wrong. So, for example, the model, you know, between, you know, that the Greeks had, like, it was wrong, but it still were able to make predictions. And I wouldn't be surprised if you can make the same type of, I don't even know exactly how it works because it's so complicated.
Sure.
But some kind of pattern recognition, even if it changes the system, like you build something
absolutely.
on top of it.
Like here's the thing: is that there's kind of like three layers to my take on astrology. The first is I don't like it. I don't like it because I am trying to find a system under which, like, multiple magic systems can coexist, and astrology makes that project very, very difficult. The second layer is, here's why I acknowledge it works for the practitioners, and then it layers back to, but I don't think it'll work for me because of how I process things. So the first layer is, I don't like it because I find it contradictory across multiple systems, and it's one of the very few things where you can't really have multiple systems running on it at once. The second thing is, so this gets into, and this paper is actually published, so I'm kind of happy about that. It's a paper called Foresight and Wisdom, the Case of the Classic of Changes, which we use the Classic of Changes, or like I Ching divination, as kind of the lens through which to explore this. But the argument itself works for all systems of divination, theoretically. Or I guess more specifically, they work for all systems of randomized divination. So There's an interesting project at Harvard called the Prediction Project, which is an attempt to catalog all human efforts to predict the future. Everything from divination to statistics. It's really cool. But in doing so, they also classify methods of predicting the future into several types. And if I remember off the top of my head, kind of three of the more prominent ones are random, where just like, this is things like the flights of birds and like clouds and stuff like that, where it's just like the order is so mind-bogglingly complicated that a human mind could not possibly like derive any sort of pattern out of it. Flickering flames, things like that. Then there is randomized, which is probably the most common, which is there is a set of like fixed things, but they are cast in such a way that it introduces chaos to the system. Tarot card reading, for instance, the Yoruba method of divination, I can't remember how it works off the top of my head. Casting lots, etching divination, all that is randomized because there's a fixed set of symbols, but then you kind of throw them into chaos, and out of the chaos you pull meaning. And then there are fixed systems, under which it's like there is no chaos here. There is no disorder. The entire thing is like one big grand cosmic symphony. And astrology falls under this. So the way that randomized systems at least work, I think, is what you have got is, basic human capacity for pattern recognition. But humans are unfortunate creatures in that we are very cognitively slippery. It is actually very, very difficult for us to have a thought or an intuition, grip it and hold it at arm's length and say, okay, why do I think this? That takes years, if not decades of training sometimes. So what things like tarot cards or I Ching divination does is it creates a system where there's kind of loose symbolism associated with every possible combination. But for each individual instance of consultation, it randomizes the system and spits out a random result. And this is where people will say, aha, the Barnum effect. It only looks relevant to your particular situation. Well, that's a feature. That's not a bug. Because what I think these things are doing is the randomized symbols are creating almost like fly paper or sticky paper that you can kind of tack your thoughts to and give them something external to hold them while you go over them. So kind of using symbolism, they allow you to project a narrative onto something that is ultimately objectively meaningless. But you can imbue it with meaning, and imbuing it with meaning allows you to magnify your ability to examine your own pattern recognition abilities. So the way that I think this potentially salvages astrology is that, yes, technically speaking, astrology is a fixed system because like stars and what have you. But arguably, because each person is different, the sheer instance of a person being born randomizes the possible space of, well, this could be in like the first house and here's where this moon is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Each individual, like, it's kind of one of those, like, it would basically be like tarot card reading if you could only read the tarot cards once and then they were stuck that way for all eternity. That makes sense. So theoretically, that might salvage it, but at the same time, I don't like it because I think the concept of a reading that grand scale is doomed to too many interpretations.
Right. Got it.
I have a slight, if we're talking about like Western Renaissance divination systems, I have a slight bias towards geomancy.
I have no idea what that is. You can explain that a bit if you want. Since I forced you to explain something you don't like, you should now have a counterbalance.
it was kind of like the other like competing system with astrology, where basically what people did is like they sometimes it involved like throwing dice, sometimes it involved like dotting lines on a sand tray, but basically what you would create is a sequence of either one or two dots in order, and that would create a particular image that could be interpreted. It's a little bit like a simplified version of the I Ching, except Western.
You mentioned that, well, in your work, not in this podcast, but I've seen you write that meditation is a very big foundation in most magical systems. And we haven't got into meditation yet, but I'm pretty curious about how that relates. So maybe we can flesh that out a little bit.
Sure. It's a basic control exercise. You know, one of the biggest difficulties with learning magic, especially honestly for somebody who would be naturally inclined towards it through being high in absorption, is having any sort of control over it. So what meditation will teach you is control over your thoughts and images and things like that. The various disciplines will allow you to call up a thought when you need it, or call up an image when you need it, and put it away afterwards. Because one of the reasons why, and like this is another thing that I'm a little bit cautious about, is I don't think most people should do magic. Honestly, it's dangerous. Because like basically what can happen is, if you don't have that kind of control over your own mental processes, they can start to become invasive. Right? I know a few people who were born with natural gifts of empathy that they find very difficult to turn off. So like being around other people is difficult for them, because if there's any sort of emotional fluctuations in the room, it hurts them. Similar things can happen with magical practice, where, if you train yourself to see the world in a certain way, like let's say, or, my personal favorite, the people who are trying to practice tulpamancy. Every once in a while on like tulpamancy forums, you see people saying, "Help, my tulpa won't leave me alone." Tulpa basically being like somewhere between like a thought form creation and like an imaginary friend on steroids, where you're basically creating a separate entity that lives in your imagination. So people will occasionally write, "Help, my tulpa won't leave me alone. What do I do?" And I'm like, of course it won't leave you alone. You've like made an unbound summoning ritual, you idiot. Like, the entire point of most magical practices is to have an off switch. Like, this is why Wiccans are like very strict on, no. You cast a circle before you do anything, because the creation of that ritual space creates a mental boundary between your working world and the world in which you have to live in, so that the magic does not follow you back. Because like, the ability to work in what Susan Greenwood calls magical modes of consciousness is like fantastic for like introspection and processing and stuff like that. You don't want to live that way.
I also think that that's a problem of our culture that is very, very obsessed about this individualistic journey into whatever you're interested in, whatever you want to pursue, when these things in the past have been usually passed down. So for example, a shaman doesn't just, decide to become a shaman and it just becomes one. Like, there's an insane amount of training from elder shamans, and even that kid was probably chosen. He didn't just decide to become one.
Yep.
And so there's a whole tutoring process that goes into these things, and that gives some security, because even though they may not fully know what they're doing, at least through the test of time, some of the symbols, just out of, just because it tends to work over time, the symbolism has developed that tends to make these things better. So if you're trying to do it from the ground up and you have no idea what you're doing, well, you're probably going to have a bad time.
Exactly. Like, for like another example, and like maybe this is why I have less of an issue with the idea that like, no, magic requires like a whole lot of formal training and maybe not everybody should do this. I grew up doing martial arts, which is kind of like a similar bag. Like, So it turns out like punching people is easy. Punching people safely in a manner that like does not injure yourself, that's hard. Or like most of my practice these days is sword play. Like that's another thing. Yeah, hitting somebody with sword, actually not that difficult. Doing so in a way that doesn't get you potentially killed in return, that's much harder.
Right. When I was trying to look at some of your work, which is very obscure, by the way, that was annoying. Like I had to really dig the internet to get some of your work. You should be more out there because some of it's fascinating.
Yeah, some of it is more out there, some of it isn't. I don't know. I'm kind of a quiet person personally.
Right. But anyway, within that search, I did come to your sword fights, and this is completely unrelated, but I found it very fascinating. So maybe let's just do a little break from magic, and I'm very curious about what's made you get into it. Like, what did you get out of it, and where was that interest born out of? Because it's not a very popular thing. Like, it's not, like, I don't know many people that are in sword fighting.
I don't know. How did you start playing the piano?
I didn't. That was my girlfriend, but it does have an explanation for her because she was a musician and she was just attracted to it. Well, I guess that doesn't explain very much, does it? No, I just realized that. Well, that's fair enough.
I mean, Korean family tradition is the kids learn martial arts. Like that's the kid, most Korean families. And then so I did that for a bit, but then I personally preferred weapons play to barehanded. So, and I'd always had an interest in medieval history and stuff like that. So first I did fencing lessons. Then I did kendo for a bit. Then I switched into traditional Korean swordsmanship. Then I got into historical reenacting, and then I got into it's referred to as HEMA, or historical European martial arts, along with a bit of Tai Chi on the side. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of just a natural progression. I like it because there's I am very much not a team sports person. I have nothing against them. I just don't find them terribly interesting. And swordplay is kind of like an argument, in that there is a back and forth between two people's ways of thinking and processing. And yeah, I don't know. I enjoy the back and forth.
See, it does look very fun. Is the equipment all what people used back then, or does it have modifications to make it easier or safer?
I mean, fencing masks are kind of a modern invention. They first started cropping up in I think the early 1800s, maybe a little bit. But yeah. I mean, this is kind of an interesting trade-off, right? Because one of the things that I am reasonably certain of is because people back then, you'd have a sword in your hand for several hours a day, every single day of your life from when you were 7. I'm reasonably certain that their level of control would have been significantly better than ours. So you can get away with less equipment when you have a training partner that really knows what they're doing. We'll train without equipment some days. We'll wear gloves and eye protection and stuff like that. But it's basically just yep, you should have enough control by now to not hurt your opponent. But that's a difficult level to hit.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, when people play sports, even when it's not fighting sports, people already get hurt pretty easily. So if you're trying to simulate a kind of hurting or even hurting in a playful manner, like in a playful combat, then that seems very hard to get it right.
Well, and I mean, this is the irony, right? That because so much attention is paid to safety, because we are doing something that is inherently unsafe. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now. I haven't had a single major injury. I've had some tennis elbow and I botched a shoulder roll once, pinched a nerve in my shoulder, but like I've recovered from all of those, and I wouldn't count any of them as like major. My sister, on the other hand, plays more conventional sports, and she's had like 5 concussions.
Jesus.
So
yeah, it's surprisingly common actually. It's pretty scary.
So yeah, I feel perfectly safe doing what I'm doing most of the time, largely because, well, there's a lot of safety equipment involved, and the entire name of the game is defending yourself from injury.
Right. Gotcha.
So,
before we got into swords, we were talking about meditation, and I'm curious about how meditation and hypnosis, and I don't think you mentioned trance in your papers, but I'll say that's pretty important and kind of in the same realm. Would you consider trance as part of ritual, or how do you conceptualize these and how these all interact together?
I'd say trance and hypnosis. I think hypnosis is usually something that somebody else does to you, whereas trance is usually something that you do to yourself. The common thread through meditation that both of them has is meditation is really more of a control exercise. I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example. I don't really play basketball, but my sister does. Meditation is like your practice. That is when you practice dribbling the ball and passing it back and forth, and occasionally practicing free throws and stuff like that. Whereas trance and hypnosis are like playing the actual game, but trance is like your own side of things, whereas hypnosis is somebody else doing it. Maybe basketball was a bad example because you don't want people to dunk on your net, but hypnosis is basically people dunking on your net. I don't know. This is, or maybe dance. Dance is a better way to do it, where like meditation is practicing rhythm and footwork and things like that. And trance is practicing leading, whereas hypnosis is practicing following. Yeah, it's kind of a difference between practice and application, I think.
Right. And since you mentioned, and since you talked about trance, I kind of got this image in my head that I'm not sure exactly how accurate it is. About, we kind of have this idea of the magician, kind of like, I don't know, like in some weird part of the house with a crystal ball and a bunch of potions and stuff, and a very individualistic approach. But then there's also the other parts of magic, which is like a group together, making some enchantments, trying to summon things. So I'm not exactly sure which one. First of all, how do they interact if they were both common throughout history, and also if this is an accurate picture, or because it's so hard now to know exactly what people did back then, because most of our knowledge comes from movies and whatever, and so like people that direct those knew what they were doing. So it's hard to have an accurate sense. So how do these individualistic versus collective practices work out?
I mean, like every other craft, you have solitary practice and you have collective practice, right? COVID has seen me do a lot of fencing drills in my apartment by myself, but we've recently been allowed to start fencing again, so that's been nice. Yeah, the other thing I think that you have to kind of pay attention to is space and time, really, right? Like, there are situations in which the practice of magic is a little bit less acceptable than others, so you kind of stay underground summoning your demons or talking to your angels by yourself, because that's safer than being open about it. Meanwhile, if you're like pre-Christian Norse, yeah, you can do your rituals publicly as much as you want, right? Like, and these days, like most of the Wiccans that I know have both a private and a public practice. where there's stuff that they do by themselves because it hones their skills and hones their crafts and hones their connection with their gods. And then there's stuff that they do together. Yeah, it's like playing basketball with your team versus being at the court solo, doing free throws, because that's an important part of your day.
We've talked about magic a lot, but something that I also wanted to get into is psychedelics. So for one, because I'm very interested in psychedelics. Two, because it's also related to magic and wisdom, and also there's you can have a very fruitful conversation with cognitive science as well. And I've read your paper on microdosing, and I found that really fascinating to read because I've had this intimation of exactly the relationship between psychedelics in general with the meaning crisis and also microdosing more specifically. And part of the reason why I'm such a fan or enthusiast for psychedelics is because I think there's such an important key to kind of get out of the problem that we have in modern society. It's kind of like, and some people kind of disagree with me, but I think psychedelics are probably not going to be just a tool, but they're going to be the thing that gets us out of this like hyper materialistic culture that we're in. And at the time when I was younger, I was very optimistic about this. And I thought, well, the political stigma about it is decreasing because of how useful they are for psychiatry. This is going to all be legalized at some point. It's just a matter of time. And then, this is going to have a huge beneficial effect on culture. But as I gotten older, I've started to see the dangers of it, not for the individuals in particular, even though that can happen as well, but more for society in general. And part of what made that salient to me was precisely microdosing. Because there's kind of several approaches to psychedelics, and kind of one of them we can say is like medicine. People that just need help. They have post-traumatic stress disorder, they have depression, they have anxiety, whatever. And then there's another group which is kind of maybe they don't have any serious condition, but they just want to get themselves better. It's kind of like a spiritual journey. But then there's the kind of the productivity element to it that's really, really strong in microdosing. And I don't think you mentioned that in the paper, but it's kind of like the stereotypical modern Silicon Valley, entrepreneur. And even though I think psychedelics have such a good promise to help solve the meaning crisis, I see the microdosing has exactly the opposite. Like they're driving us deeper into the problem. So I would like just your opinion about this kind of duality of psychedelics, and if you agree with it or you think I'm a bit off base with it.
I'll preface it by saying that I don't think psychedelics in any dose amount are going to solve our problem. Largely just because, hammers don't build houses, right? You can use a hammer to build a house. You can also use it to take one apart. You can also use it to kneecap people. It's a hammer. It doesn't do anything of its own volition. And my take on psychedelics is really all I think that they are is an absorption accelerant, where if Lerman is correct and absorption is basically base talent for magic, psychedelics are kind of artificial magic inducers, where they give people all they're really doing is making people's experience a little bit more vivid. And you can do a lot of interesting things with that, right? Like, for some people, it's like, wow, I have never felt more connected to the world around me. This is great. This is deeply profound. What have I been doing with my life? That's not guaranteed. So as far as the apparent duality of psychedelics, I don't think there is a duality to psychedelics there. I think what you observed is people. It's like Some people use martial arts as a means to pursue self-cultivation and enlightenment and all those other wonderful things. Some people use it to learn how to beat people up. It's a practice. It's a tool. There is no good or bad to it. Some people use firearms to go hunting to provide for their family. Other people go on murder sprees.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. Although, it kind of depends how you see. I mean, obviously it's just a tool, but it kind of depends on how you see the relevance of that tool. And this is actually something that I didn't say, but something that I kind of clump this together. It's not just psychedelics, because this is kind of it's kind of a bit broader than that. Because just like I said, this duality of like getting out of kind of some of the problems that we have in our culture, and also using it for ends that are probably not going to be very productive. This is happening exactly in the same way with meditation, for example. And obviously meditation and psychedelics are very related. Did you see the controversy with Amazon's meditation boots?
Yeah. And
that
too.
That's exactly what I mean. That's exactly the wrong path that I see being taken, and I think that's very related to psychedelics. I think it's kind of the same thing. It's kind of like you have this option of like, you either see that there is a world of meaning that you can pursue and aim at self-transformation, or you can just go down the rabbit hole of just materialism and consumerism. And it's very odd how it's the same thing, and it's launching you for two different things. And also the Silicon Valley, this also applies to meditation, not just in this really odd thing that we've seen now of Amazon as an example, but in the sense that people also, like meditation has traditionally been used, as a religious practice that's achieving you to better wisdom and getting to enlightenment. And now it's used as like, this thing that you do has like almost just because you'll feel better and because you'll be more efficient at work. Like that's a very common thing now. And to me, that's the same problem, just manifesting in two different ways. So how do you see this from the broader aspects of not just psychedelics, but meditation and all these kinds of wisdom practices?
People are people. Show me the history of humanity. When have we ever used what is ostensibly a good thing properly?
Yeah, we're pretty bad at that, it seems.
The longer that I spend with like initiatory traditions, like the Wiccans and the Sufis and things like that, the more I realize, oh yeah, this is why you don't teach normal people things. Or like the fencing school that I belong to, we make you do drills for anywhere between 6 months to 2 years before you're allowed to swing a sword at somebody. There's a reason for that. It's like, because unfortunately the like basics of it is skillful use of any practice is hard. That is why we have specialists dedicated towards their use.
Well, but that kind of ties with the problem that I also think this is creating, because these practices now are kind of being re-emerging in culture that are very, very old, but we don't have the specialists anymore. Like we don't have shamans anymore. We don't have wisdom institutions anymore. So like with you go to martial arts and you have a teacher, but we don't have teachers for these things anymore.
Sure we do. You just have to look a little harder.
Sorry, I didn't hear you all.
No, they exist. You just have to look harder for them these days. One of the things that I think is the problem is that like the internet has made everybody expect that they're going to be able to find these things very easily in their own backyard. That's never been the case. Like there's all these stories of like, oh, so-and-so went on a pilgrimage, or like, one of the fencing manuals that we work with is like, it took me like 30 years of my life to become a master, traveling all around Italy and Germany at like great personal expense. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that is a good point. I think we've been a bit spoiled in our modern culture. That
Yeah,
when
and
you put it that way, it's
like we kind of touched on my infamous dislike of Jung earlier in the show, but this is actually kind of the core of my infamous dislike of Jung. Is I personally think he was very, very irresponsible in letting a bunch of things just out there, because most people don't know how to process or use the stuff that he kind of just left lying around. Um, like learning these things is hard. Like I'd consider myself at this point vaguely okay with a sword, and I've been at it for like 15 years. Um, I've been at Tai Chi for 8, and I've been at like meditation for about 10 ish. Like these are things that take a very long time to learn. And I think modern culture has made us expect, oh, this should be easy or there should be a quick fix for things. Nah, things are hard. You have to put some work in. And that's why I don't think like anything like psychedelics or meditation is going to fix anything, because I think nothing is going to be fixed until we realize that the fix isn't going to be fast. Until we as a culture are willing to put 10 or 20 years into something, nothing's going to happen.
Yep, those are good points. Something that I'd like to touch on as well is I read I think it's your latest study, at least the latest that I could find, about personal growth in the COVID lockdown.
Oh yeah. We were happy about that one.
Yeah, so that was very cool. I really liked it, and so maybe explain a bit on the background of the study. Like, what were you trying to achieve, and why did you decide to study this?
Right. I mean, one thing that I'll preface is like, I only consider myself technically first author on that one. I barely even consider it my study, because it was like, there's this checklist that the American Psychological Association uses to determine author order on papers. And I ended up first purely because I was doing all of the bureaucratic stuff for it. As far as like the organization and the like actual like submitting and responding to reviewers and things like that. But it was very much a group project. So it actually came out of one of the other authors on the paper, Stephanie, kind of way back at the beginning of like social distancing and lockdown, wondering how people were spending their time during lockdown. Like, what are people filling their days with? And so that got leveraged in kind of a lab project, and everybody brought their pet measures into it to kind of see, yeah, what are people doing? And like, what people are doing during this insane time doing to them? So yeah, and like, as you can read the paper, but like what we ended up finding is the best predictor, once you've controlled for like pre-pandemic well-being, the best predictor of current well-being is achieving some degree of self-transcendence. And when we split the sample and looked at what are people who are high in transcendence doing versus what people in lower transcendence doing, people who are high in transcendence were finding ways to spend time with family, trying to maintain their connections, reevaluating their life. A couple of people got very political. Those were very interesting ones to read. Versus the people who were low in self-transcendence were just like, yeah, I've been playing a lot of video games, and like not in a, because like the higher transcendence group also mentioned playing a lot of video games, but they did it in the sense of, yeah, I've been like scheduling time with my friends to like play video games over co-op so that we can hang out and talk to each other. versus there was really no mention of the social element of it in the lower transcendence group. And there was a lot of things like, yeah, I mean, I've been buying groceries. That was the highlight of my week. So yeah, it's one of these groups was living, the other group was surviving.
Mm-hmm. And was there? I mean, I didn't have time to study the study very in depth. I just kind of skimmed it. Did you try to find out why those different responses occur? Like obviously, you said that people who are interested in improving themselves and trying to have meaningful connections and whatnot, they have more positive outcomes and whatnot. But what led to that perspective in the beginning? Was that something that you tried to find out?
I mean, this is what I'm trying to find out with my thesis work is basically like, where do these projects of like, yeah, I'm going to try and use this time to be a better person. Where does that even come from? Because like the only difference that we found between like the high transcendence and low transcendence group demographically is that the high transcendence group was more likely to be religious, which I mean, that's not nothing. That's kind of interesting. That already speaks of a basic orientation towards like growth and thinking that things beyond yourself are important, et cetera, et cetera. But that can't be the only thing. But it was the only thing that we dug up that was statistically significant.
Right. And has there been any work looking into this that hasn't, been specific to COVID, but that maybe tried to look into what affects these perspectives on different people?
Surprisingly little. Like there's some stuff on like, okay, what does like personal projects pursuit have to do with the pursuit of virtue? And then there's stuff like, oh, what does an orientation towards virtue, what effect does that have on wise reasoning and things like that? But there's actually been very little that I've been able to find on people just asking the basic question, why do people decide to become better people?
So, yeah, you mentioned that your thesis was related to that. Can you, first of all, what stage of the thesis are you on? And maybe you could explain a bit what is it about and what are you trying to achieve?
So I'm at the everybody's favorite stage of a research project, which is cleaning the goddamn data. Fortunately, my data is particularly messy because it's time series data, which is a nightmare. But more or less what I'm trying to find is, one, can we use this research method that we've been using to identify aspirations in a student population? Like, there's goals, which are like, I want to get an A in this course, or like, I would like to get my degree, or things like that. But like, those are things that have a like very clear specific endpoint. And they don't actually involve the student changing all that much. What I'm looking for are what Agnes Callard refers to as aspirations. These are kind of ongoing pursuits that result in the transformation of the person. Somebody saying like, I would like to be kinder. That seems like a good way to do things. Or like, I would like to be slightly wiser, or like things like that. So the question that I'm basically asking is like, I'm basically phrasing it as, what are the 5 like most like top of mind things to you right now? Because I don't want people to have to dig for their aspirations. Like there are ways that I could eventually get to that, like things like, hey, like give me 15 projects and choose the 10 most important. The reason why I ended up constraining it to 5 is because I want to see what these people are most fixated on. And it turns out that the most common projects among undergraduate students are get a good grade in this course, get my degree, get married, go to the gym more regularly, go to medical school. Like, that's great. It's a little boring. So mostly what I'm interested in is like, okay, like what percentage of the student population actually like spontaneously reports aspirations? Turns out very few. Very few people. And then the next question is, well, okay, if we have like, if I study the students who are kind of in a course that's on more like aspirational subject matter, like, you know, self-transcendence, wisdom, virtue, meaning, stuff like that, versus students who are in like a bog standard cog sci class, do I find like per capita more people interested in, like, more people with aspirational projects in the aspirational class? So basically, kind of from a perspective of, if we build it, will they come? Like, you know, like if we have these classes on more aspirational subject matter, does this start pulling people out of the woodwork? And then next phase of the project is, all right, cool. And then once we've found those people, can we give people aspirations? Like, you know, here's our class on like aspirational subject matter, or like, you know, here's a class on aspirational subject matter, but it's all essay based, versus like, oh, we want you to like read the biography of a saint or something like that, and like tell us things about his life, or like try to live according to a particular philosophy for a day. If we like ask people like once a month, so what are some important things to you at the moment? Do more of them start reporting aspirations as they're exposed to ideas like wisdom, virtue, meaning, things like that? Because this is the question that I find very interesting, that like nobody seems to ask. Everybody's always like, okay, like once people care about like becoming wiser, can we make them any wiser? That's great. I'm more interested, like, can I make people care about this to begin with?
Which seems a much bigger problem.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, the problem is not like getting people from point B to point C. The problem is getting people from point A to point B.
Right. And what do you have like any research ideas of where you want to go after you finish your thesis? You have stuff planned out?
Oh God. I mean, like, I think one of the things that I might start doing is like trying to study these sorts of things in like specific groups. Like, it would be really interesting to like get like, hey, can I like get a bunch of Sufis to like do this as well? And like, all right, I've done this in the university context. Can I like do it among like spiritual practitioners? Like, what is the difference between like, if I like, you know, go to like a church versus go to like specifically a mystical community? What do like, does like the actual like practice of mysticism do anything? Like, yeah, basically I'm just now trying to figure out, how do we make people dream a little bit bigger? Because, you know, like I see all the problems that we were talking about earlier, right? Like, you know, if you give, let's give people psilocybin. Like, this could like give you an awakening experience and like make you feel more connected to reality. Cool. I'm going to eat very tiny amounts of it every single day so that I'm more productive at work. That's not a failure of the substance. That's a failure of the aspirations of the person. So my question is, okay, but how do we fix that problem? Because that's the actual issue.
And do you think that maybe psychedelics have a use in answering that question? Because a very peculiar thing about psychedelics is because they seem to precisely make that jump. It's like you like they almost force you to want to change. Like, it's very normative.
I personally have not seen that effect. I don't think that's a thing that really spontaneously happens. I think that is something that a lot of studies have failed to control for. Like, it would be absolutely fascinating to like get people's like personal projects before psychedelic dose and after psychedelic dose, right? Because the thing that I'm concerned about is that I think the only people, like the majority of people who are interested in psychedelics at a baseline, which is what causes control issues, are people who are interested in change, right? Like, if I say, hey, do you want to participate in a study on mind-altering drugs? If you don't want your mind altered, you don't participate in that study. That's kind of just how this works. It's what makes placebo-controlling psychedelic studies so difficult.
Mm-hmm. But within kind of studies on mental health kind of change that a bit? Because a lot of times you're producing change in people, that you can say, okay, fine, they wanted to change because, you know, no one wants to be depressed and no one wants to be addicted, but they've tried and they failed. So it's forcing them to make that, you know, that gap and to kind of get to that point.
For sure, but that's showing people a way forward on an aspiration they'd given up on. That's not giving people a new aspiration. You know, that's like saying somebody, oh, you know, it's like I've tried to like go to like school and like I'd love to get my degree and stuff like that, but it just doesn't like work with my schedule and I have to take care of the kids. Like, well, I know this program that has free childcare and lets you do night classes. Right? It's like, here's a way forward that maybe you hadn't thought of before. It's not giving them something new. It's giving them a new way to work on something that they'd given up on.
Good point. So trying to connect it to the magic that we talked before, how do you see the work on magic kind of interplay with all of this, with a drive to get better? Like, so do you think there's a connection with wisdom and kind of setting ambitions for yourself and also the underlying cognitive process of magic, or do you think you kind of put them on different boxes?
I mean, nobody gets into magic who doesn't want to feel some sort of transformation. Like, that's kind of the entire thing with magic. Like, magic is the set of psychotechnologies by which people achieve transformation. Can be a basic transformation of perception. It can be transformation of themselves, the way that they live the world. You know, things that are referred to as black magic are almost universally transformation of other people without their consent. Don't do magic to other people without consent, kids. One, it rarely works, and two, it usually backfires. But, you know, this is something that my advisor, Ferrari, and I talk about every once in a while, which is there's kind of like mundane forms of transformation, and then there's what you might call like super mundane forms of transformation. Like, there's people who are like, yeah, I'd like to be a little bit nicer to people, or like, yes, I'd like to be a little bit less temperamental or reactive. And then there's people who are like, I want to feel one with all of creation. One of these is a slightly larger transformation than the others.
Just a little bit.
So this is kind of what I find fascinating is, like, again, like, there's clearly like, I don't think that there's a question of quality anymore, right? Because, you know, one of the things that I'm trying to do with the aspiration stuff is do a little bit of an update to the personal projects literature, where personal projects analysis, unfortunately, like, treats projects like Keep the Grass Mown and Liberate My People from Pharaoh as like the same kind of thing. And I don't think that's quite right. I think some projects are qualitatively different than others. I don't think, like, yes, I would like to be wiser or kinder or more virtuous is as qualitatively different from I want to feel one with all of creation as it is from I need to keep my lawn mown. So I think that one's more of a question of scale, but there's still the interesting open question of why, like, what leads somebody to like have that scale of a desire for transformation versus somebody who's just like, yeah, I'd like to be a little bit less angry some of the time. So I think as the aspirations get grander in scale, the practices that you need to engage in order to achieve those aspirations and those transformations get correspondingly more complex. So that's why the interest in magic and mysticism, because it's kind of like, okay, do you want to change a little or do you want to change a lot? Do you want to change like a one small thing or do you want to change everything?
And so for the people that have that drive of the big transformation, but you say that you're not, you seem that, you know, playing with magic is not the smartest idea for most people. What do you envision that to look like in a secularized modern society?
I don't think most people need as big of a change as they think they do. Right? You know, it's like most people do not need to go after like the fly buzzing around their living room with like an AK-47. A fly swatter will do. I don't know. This is, I think, where Dan and I differ a little bit. I do not think most people need magic. I think most people can live very happy lives without magic. But my interest has always kind of been with those few people who are interested in going a little bit further. So, because one of the problems that I think we have with our society is like, there's just no map, right? Like there's no, outside of like the mindless acquisition of material wealth, there's no map to self-improvement. There's no like, here's our highest ideal of what a human should be. And everybody can point at that human and go, yes, this is the ideal. Because, you know, for a long time, that was somebody who was very rich. And then we got a bunch of people who were very rich. And then we realized that those people are probably monsters.
Well, that's kind of what religion has tried to fix. It's like there's this ideal that one should strive for, and
right.
that rules above everything else. But people, even if they believe, they tend not to follow that anyway somehow.
But much like every system of thought, I think religion has a life cycle, right? I think the question of who should we be and how should we live is what keeps religion as a category open. But the specific image that fills that in needs to change from generation to generation. The ideal of the modern world cannot be the same as the ideal of the 1500s, no matter how much I'd like them to be the same thing. So I am interested in kind of charting the processes of self-transformation so that I can have a map that is not necessarily tied to a particular image. It'd be nice if people can say, oh, I'd like to be like this sort of person. Cool. Here is the sequence of transformations by which you arrive at like this sort of thing. You don't have to go there if you don't want to. That's fine. Nobody's telling you that that's a thing you need to do. But if you want to do it, there you go. It's like most people also don't need to climb mountains. Yet people do, and there they are. And some people would be very upset if mountain climbing was not an option.
That's a really good place to start, and I really, I think you really encapsulated well. I think your drive and your interest in this, and that I also share. Like anything that relates to wisdom, like the work of Reiki has been very inspirational to me, and for some reason, people that he hangs out with also seem to be also really damn smart and really damn insightful. And I think you nailed it in your last response, and that they share the same sentiment. And I hope that your work kind of progresses on that shines light on that, and that can make our map better, because I think it's a map that we should follow, even though we don't have it. that's what we should strive for.
I think it's going to be an interesting couple of months.
Awesome. I'll look forward to it. So I don't want to steal much more of your time, even though I can talk for a long time with you. But this has been awesome, and I really appreciate you coming here, and I really liked it. And your work is fascinating, and basically every time you talk, it's amazing. Like I said this about your papers, but I'll also say it as your presence online. Like I get that you're a bit introverted and whatnot, but I think it's a shame that you don't have more podcasts available, for example. And maybe it's something to consider, because I think it's valuable. I think people, because not only is it valuable because I think it gives value to people in the content that you're giving out, but I think also from an inspiration standpoint, because I don't know if I'm gonna go into research or not, but I might, and if I don't, then someone else might do it because they saw this podcast or they saw Reiki's conversation with you, for example. So I think it's also a way to put this type of work out there, and some people are going to look at it and say, this is really cool. I should look into this. And maybe a small percentage of them will even contribute towards it.
Maybe I'll talk myself into it one of these days.
I hope so. Okay, so thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Oh, yeah. No problem. You're welcome.
Awesome. Okay, so have a good day.
You too.